This is KOOP HD1 HD3 Hornsby, radio for people, not for profit. Welcome to Volumes, the Austin Public Library radio show. Each week, we explore how your library is more than books. The library is knowledge, technology, and inspiration for our community. Hey, this is Kanya Lyons. Welcome to Volumes. Our guest this week is the Austin History Center manager, Mike Miller. And I've been trying to get him on the show since the show started over a year ago. So I'm really excited that he finally was able to come here and share his wealth of knowledge in history and his love of archives. So today we're going to talk about the historical significance of Juneteenth and how it's been celebrated in Austin over the years. And, Juneteenth is June 19th, so it is just around the corner. So very timely. Anyway, so welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you, Kanya.
Thanks for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So I guess before we kind of dive into our topic of discussion today about Juneteenth, I would love to know a little bit of your background. Like, where are you from and what motivated you to become an archivist?
Sure. Well, I'm from the Dallas area, which is where I grew up, Plano, Texas, North Dallas suburb. And I got started in the archives world kind of roundabout. I was a PhD fellow in history at the University of North Texas. I started that program in '93. And as I was getting closer to finishing my dissertation, I was looking at the job market for PhD historians, and it was pretty dismal. Pretty dismal.
Sad.
And so I kind of had like an epiphany one night that maybe that wasn't the best route to go. But as a PhD historian, I spent a lot of time in archives researching.
Right.
So I figured if I couldn't be an academic historian, the next best thing was to get to play with the old documents for a living. And I went to work in the archives at the Dallas Public Library. It was my first professional job, and mentored under the archivist there, Carol Rourke, who's still my mentor and good friend.
Aww.
And so shout out to Carol. She lives in Austin sometimes now, so she might be listening. So thank you, Carol, if you're listening. And then that's when I got the local history bug. So Carol really turned me on to the importance of celebrating and documenting, community history and local history, and the rest is history, so they say.
And so I've been at the library for about a decade, and you predate me. So how long have you been at the History Center?
12 years. It'll be 12 years in September. Yeah.
Wow. We are so lucky to have you.
Oh, thank you.
And for those folks that don't know, the Austin History Center is just a treasure trove of amazingness. I love to go there. So I guess before we dive in, can you just tell me, or for those listeners that I know what it is, but for the listeners that may not know, what is the Austin History Center real quick
Sure. Yeah. So here's the elevator speech. So the Austin History Center is the local history and archives division of the Austin Public Library. And what that means in real terms is that our job is to document, preserve, and celebrate the story of Austin, Texas. And we've kind of two functions. We're the official archives for the city of Austin. So one of the hats I wear is I am the city archivist.
Yay.
For the city of Austin. And that means that all the different various city departments throughout history, they create records, they create documents that they use in going about their business. And at some point, they no longer need those documents to do their business, but they have historic value. They have enduring value.
Yes.
So then they come to us for long-term preservation and care, and then make them available for future researchers to, better understand how we governed ourselves in the past. And then the second part of our mission is to document the community, and that's documenting the entire community. For a long time, archives have been, very white. Archives were created so that white historians could tell the story of great white men in history. That's how they started.
Yep. Sad but true.
But the History Center has been committed to not discounting that. We still want to tell those. We still want to understand the mayors of Austin, and they've all been predominantly white men, although we've been changing a lot in the recent history. But then tell the stories of everyday Austinites, of all races, creeds, colors, walks of life, because with all of those little stories, you get a big sense of what the greater story of Austin is. And it's not one person's story. It's the sum of all of our stories is the story of Austin, and so that's what we're trying to do.
Fantastic. Yeah, actually, one of our, I think it's next week, or the week after. I'm not sure, but pretty soon we're going to have Tim Hamblin on to talk about. So we'll get to learn a little more about the diversity of the Austin History Center. But so now, I guess if folks are just joining us, this is Volumes, the Austin Public Library radio show, and this is Co-op 91.7 FM. And we're also streaming at koop.org. And details about this show are online at library.austintexas.gov/volumes. So we're talking today with the Austin History Center's manager, Mike Miller, and we're about to dive into our topic of the day, which is Juneteenth and kind of the historical significance of the celebration. So I guess let's start from the beginning. Why do we celebrate on June 19th? I guess it started in 1865 was when the first Juneteenth was June 19th, 1865. So can you talk a little bit about that date and its historical significance?
Yes. So Juneteenth, it's a pretty much it started as a Texas holiday, although it has gone nationally. But after the Civil War, Texas was the last of the former Confederate states to receive word that the war was over and for Union troops to arrive. And Union forces arrived in Texas on June 19th, 1865. They landed at Galveston under the command of General Granger. And it was at that point that General Granger announced to the crowd that gathered to meet the forces at Galveston Bay that, among other things, all the slaves in Texas were now free, based on Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect on January 1st, 1863, basically saying that all slaves in states that were in rebellion against the United States, which would be the states that had seceded, Lincoln proclaimed them free, but of course, until Union forces arrived to take over the state, they were never freed, even though most of the slaves probably heard word of that in those intervening years. Yeah, so they would know, but what could they do? I mean, they were still the states were still under Confederate rule,
right?
But if you think about it, the whites in their kitchens or homes, we'd be talking about. They would get the news. They got the news that Lincoln issued this proclamation, and that was to go into effect January 1st, 1863. So they would talk about it. But who's serving their meal? It's their slaves. So their slaves hear this,
right?
And then they go out and they had a great network to share news. So kind of like today, when like the current homeless population, they have a great network to share news, and it's within 24 hours, every homeless person in the city of Austin knows when something happens.
Almost as fast as Twitter,
or faster. And so it's a very similar situation for the slaves in Texas at the time. Maybe not as quick because it probably took longer for travel, but the news would go quickly. So slaves probably knew that Lincoln
freedom was coming.
It would depend on who won, what the result of the war was. But because there was home guards and stuff, but they couldn't just walk off the fields without retribution, because then the vigilante committees would chase them down and usually issue some type of martial punishment.
Something horrific.
Which is why they just stayed until Granger came and issued that proclamation. And Texas was the last one to get the news. So June 19th became known as Emancipation Day. And so for a long time, that's what they called it. They didn't call it Juneteenth. It was called Emancipation Day, and they celebrated it as Emancipation Day. And eventually, June 19th, Juneteenth, it all kind of got merged and became Juneteenth.
Wow, that's really fascinating history. So I guess no internet, no phones, no radio. Did they have? How was everything just by horseback? Messenger service kind of a thing.
Yeah. And particularly in Austin, it was interesting. The state of Texas at the time, of course, was under blockade, and so news was hard to come by during the war years anyway. Right. And they relied on stagecoaches out of New Orleans, and sometimes by the time the stagecoach from New Orleans reached Austin, who knows how? It's kind of like that game of telephone where the story changes over time. Because it was word of mouth news. It wasn't written down necessarily.
Right. Wow. Well, so we're probably not going to have time to really get fully into this question, but we can start it and then finish it when we come back from the break. We've only got a minute. But so it's my understanding that African-American communities throughout Austin set aside some land for these Juneteenth celebrations, or Emancipation Day, as you say it was called back in the day. So can you tell me about some of the parks that where Juneteenth has been celebrated in Austin?
Sure, and there's been many, and then of course every year there's multiple celebrations all over the community, some small, some large. Some of the earliest were at a place called Wheeler's Grove, also called Eastwoods Park, which is now just north of the university campus, and that's where some of the earliest ones were held. And we have a great series of photographs at the History Center. We're talking photos and not radio. That's perfect. But they're from the 1900 celebration at Eastwoods Park, and so it's one of the earliest photographic documentations of a Juneteenth celebration. And then the Emancipation Park was acquired and set aside in what's now the Rosewood area. The Rosewood housing projects were built over Emancipation Park.
Oh, wow.
And that was set up right around the turn of the 20th century, into the early 20th century. Because it was about that time that you started seeing communities all over the state create Emancipation Day groups, and so there was a Travis County Emancipation Association it was just a group of citizens that formed together to plan these Emancipation Day events, to acquire the land to have these celebrations, and that's when they set up the what was called Emancipation Park in that area. But then where the ACC Highland campus is, that was the St. John Institute, the St. John Orphanage, and the Missionary Baptist Institute. They used to have Juneteenth celebrations there off and on. Oh, cool. Kind of scattered around town. And we had sometimes in people's backyards. It'd be a family reunion. They would invite their family to come in, and might be a couple dozen people. They'd have a barbecue and some just some fun and celebration in their backyard.
Well, I can't wait to hear more about all of this and some of the ways that people were celebrating Juneteenth back in the early days. But we're going to take a short break from this conversation, and we're going to listen to Thomas Q. Morin read a poem, which is part of the Oral Literature Monthly series featuring the Chunkan Street Poets. This happens over at the Terrazas branch every month. Thomas is an award-winning poet and a senior lecturer in English at the Texas State University San Marcos. And after the poetry, we're going to hear about some of the events happening at the Austin Public Library, and then we'll be back to finish our conversation with Mike Miller here.
Driving while brown. You drove 5 miles under the speed limit. You kept the nose of your car out of crosswalks, signaled early. You made sure the tank was full and the spare full of air. You were pulled over because of a phone call. A puppy stumbling on the shoulder, a dirty diaper, a route to the vet blocked by construction. You were big, you were small, your clothes were plain, you wore pants, you wore a dress, a shirt with sleeves and no sleeves. The bullet left its jacket on the road. The speedometer danced at 0. Red and blue lights in the mirror. What if next time you wore a doctor's coat, a stethoscope around your neck, or your father's camouflage so you are the color of sand and rocks, or shiny black shoes, and a black suit with a white collar for your throat, and say, Hail Mary, full of grace, when you lift your hands and kneel. Maybe paint your face white like a happy clown. Say you were on your way to wave at little kids with your machete from the edge of the woods. This is a person we want, after all, to keep safe and answer some questions. Thank you.
My name is Blair Parsons, and I'm a librarian at the Central Library. Each week I highlight a few programs for adults that are happening around the Austin Public Library. Our full list of programs may be found on the library's events calendar. Tonight, Wednesday, June 13th, the Central Library will host 2018 Pulitzer Prize winner Andrew Sean Greer for a reading of and discussion about his prize-winning novel, Less. Greer's protagonist receives an invitation to his ex-boyfriend's wedding on the eve of his 50th birthday. then embarks on an international journey that finds him falling in love, risking his life, reinventing himself, and making connections with the past. Austin author Amanda Eyre Ward will moderate the conversation, and a book signing will follow the program. Pulitzer Prize winner Andrew Sean Greer will read in the Central Library's Events Center at 7 o'clock tonight, Wednesday, June 13th. Thursday night, June 14th, the House and Branch Library hosts Adult Story Hour. Participants are invited to tell a 5-minute story. Truth, fiction, funny, serious, memorized, or remembered. Listen to and share stories about life or fantasy. Enjoy a new theme at each event. This month's theme is What We Do for Love, in partnership with PBS and the Great American Read television series. Adult Story Hour begins at 7 o'clock p.m., Thursday, June 14th at the House and Branch Library.
Hey there, Austin. This is Lydia here to tell you all about this week's events at the Austin Public Libraries. Ever wanted to know how to follow your passion and run your own business? The Austin Public Library is giving teens the tools they need to get started with the Like a Boss series. This week, learn to podcast like a boss. Teens can meet actual podcasters, ask questions, and learn the technical side from the experts. Podcast Like a Boss is on the air on Saturday, June 16th at 1 p.m. at the Old Quarry Branch. This program is open to teens ages 13 to 18. More details on Podcast Like a Boss and additional summer reading programs can be found at library.austintexas.gov/events.
This is Alana Graves, the youth librarian at the Carver Branch. The summer has officially begun, and the Austin Public Library is offering summer reading events for kids. This June and July, the Austin Public Library presents a special story time with the Contemporary Austin. Children ages 3 to 5 will enjoy the picture book Beyond the Pond by Joseph Kiefler and create an art project based on the book. Beyond the Pond is a whimsical tale about a boy who embarks on an imaginative adventure in the depths of his backyard pond. This program is scheduled at 8 library branches across Austin and kicks off at the Old Quarry Branch on Wednesday, June 13th at 11 a.m. Details at library.austintexas.gov.
You're listening to Volumes, the Austin Public Library radio show on Co-op 91.7 FM and KOOP.org. Radio for people, not for profit.
Support comes from East Side Pies, local pizza with local ingredients. 3 locations around Austin: East Side off Rosewood, Airport and 53rd, and Anderson Lane. Take out or eat in. Online ordering now available at eastsidepies.com.
This is Joe,
Martha,
and Lisa,
co-hosts of Writing on the Air.
Do you like to read?
Do you like to write?
We do too, and we love bringing you the best authors and other creative types from Texas and beyond.
Listen to Writing on the Air every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Central Time.
Voted Best Book Discussion in the Austin Chronicle's 2015 Best of Austin.
Wednesday at 6 o'clock p.m.
on 91.7 FM
or KOOP.org.
Hello and welcome back to Volumes, the Austin Public Library radio show. And our guest today is Mike Miller, who is the manager of the Austin History Center. And we're talking about Juneteenth and how it has been celebrated in Austin over the years. So welcome back, Mike.
Thank you.
So right before the break, you were talking a little bit about, how the celebrations, the Juneteenth celebrations really took place kind of throughout the city, sometimes in people's backyards, sometimes in parks that were set aside for that purpose. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of like how people were celebrating? Like what were some of the activities or what was happening at these celebrations?
Sure. Oftentimes, and many of them, they started with a parade. Kind of like now, from a celebration, they closed down Congress. They would parade up Congress. It was the same dating back to the late 1860s when they first started having these. oftentimes from that, groups might break off, and you might, go to your church, and there might be a church service that would be celebrating emancipation, and, depending on where your house of worship was, and there's different ones for the African Americans around town. Then you might go home and, like I said, have a small gathering at home, or go to one of these parks and have a barbecue, and there would be live music and bands playing. Baseball was really common, both for men and women. So
interesting.
The women would play what we call softball today, but it was a very common sport in the play. And then as Austin became home to some of the semi-pro and there's a Texas Negro League that played here in the teens and 20s, and some of those teams would have stage their games in conjunction with these Juneteenth celebrations. And so there's their team called the Austin Senators, which played in what was called the Texas Negro League for about 15 years or so, off and on. And they would often have their games. They played at Downs Field, which is on the Houston-Tillotson campus. So that was kind of things that would happen. There would be, there were seems like a. It's not, I hate to say a beauty contest, but it's kind of like that. So they would have like a queen of the festival sometimes. Not always, but sometimes it would happen. Lots and lots of food. It was, food always, in so many celebrations, regardless of what culture you come from, so much of how we celebrate things in our life are always centered around food. But it always seemed to be kind of almost like a potluck in many ways, is that it was really big, a big component was sharing, is that the community would come together. And unlike today, we go to a festival and it's all lined up with food trucks, and you have to pay $100 to get a taco or something. Then it was the community just brought food and put it out, and it was kind of communal. It was part of the community to share what they had, and people brought what they had, and some people brought more, some people brought less, like you see at potlucks, and there always seemed to be more than was needed at these events. So.
Oh, cool. So you mentioned earlier there were some photographs of an earlier celebration early in the turn of the century, the 1900s. Are there other pictures like the food? I'm curious. Are there any pictures of the food? Do you know offhand? I know that's a random question.
It is a random question.
Sorry, if you don't know, it's fine.
But we do. So I'm remembering from that series from the 1900 celebration that was so well documented. There's no they didn't take food shots like today. Like like
here's my lunch.
Yes. My daughter calls it food porn when she's like posting her lunch on Instagram.
Yes.
And so they didn't have that, but there was pictures of like the picnic tables, and you could see like the barbecue pits. You see people around the barbecue pits preparing food, but it's not a close up of what it was that they were preparing.
But you get a sense of the magnitude of the celebration, and really they're celebrating freedom and and just I guess it just sounds like a real joyous
and all the details and the promise of freedom, because let's face it, the freedom that they thought they were getting, of course, is not what they received, and we're still struggling with that today. So even today, a lot of part of that celebration is celebrating the anticipation of the promise of full freedom in our community, which unfortunately many don't get to enjoy.
Even to this day, that's a very sobering fact.
Yeah. I hate to go from barbecue to that, but I want to make sure that's in there, because we shouldn't deny it. I think it's an important part of this story.
Absolutely.
I sidetracked you, Kanye. I'm sorry.
No. It made me think of this Chris Rock special I watched last night, and he said, police should probably just kill some white kids just so that it seems fair, just once in a while, just so that, and obviously he's being ridiculous, but it really kind of brings home that point of that there is still not full equality in this country or in the world. Let's just be honest. But so for those just joining us, this is Volumes, the Austin Public Library radio show. We're on Co-op 91.7 FM and streaming at koop.org. We're talking to Mike Miller, and we're talking about Juneteenth celebrations in Austin. So sorry, we got a little off track for a second. But I've read that, in the years following emancipation, that for quite some time that the African American communities, or what were called freedmen communities, were actually kind of spread out all throughout town, and that they weren't just African Americans, that there were Mexican Americans and white people all living together in these communities. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment. As you said, they were all over the area, and some vestiges of them still exist, like the Clarksville neighborhood, which is one of the more famous freedmen communities. And it started a former slave. Clark had acquired a bunch of land and was able to build a community, and there's others all scattered. And I would say they were still predominantly African American, but they weren't. It wasn't the segregation that we would see, that would start happening, at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, when you started seeing that push to, a very rigid, segregated society. That, you go back to the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision that said, separate but equal is the law of the land. So that's when you started seeing this official, we'll create separate facilities for African Americans, et cetera, because as long as they're equal, we can do that. And so that's really when you started to see in that more rigid racial segregation occurring, especially in the South. But prior to that, people kind of lived, wherever you could find a, home and get what you needed out of it. And Austin became a beacon for those freedmen communities. Just because we were the capital, and especially in those years immediately after the Civil War, for a newly freed, black person living in Texas, it was not a safe place.
Right.
Texas was not, especially
small
in
towns.
East Texas, and so coming to Austin, where the state police were, that was created by Governor Davis, when their primary functions was to protect these newly freed, black folk. And so by coming to Austin, they were putting themselves closer to those agencies that were designed to protect them from, some of the, more militant, let's say non-reformed Confederate whites.
That makes a lot of sense.
So that's why, even though we didn't, the freedmen population of Austin was much larger than the slave population, prior to emancipation, because urban centers became safe havens for a lot of the rural blacks that would leave their plantations to go somewhere safer. And to be amongst others of their, other African Americans, because they could band together, they could help each other out.
Finally,
because they weren't going to get all the help from most of the white community.
Right.
Some exceptions, of course, but predominantly, the white Southerners were not going to help these newly freed slaves.
Yeah. Gosh, I wish we had another half hour because there's so much interesting things to learn. We've actually only got about a minute left, and so we're going to skip over a couple things. I just wanted to ask you to talk for a minute about. You mentioned earlier that we are at the Austin History Center trying to document all of Austin's history and really make sure that we include everyone in the process. So can you talk a little bit about the need for documents and oral histories, especially for, the African-American community?
Certainly. So we have what's called a community archives program at the History Center. It's unique. It's one of a kind in the country. With the idea being, I mentioned earlier that archives have been predominantly created by white historians. So we've been making a concerted effort to expand our holdings to make sure we are telling that whole story. And among communities that have traditionally been ignored or underdocumented, there is a great need to make sure that as much of the information that we can capture today is put in a place where the historians are writing textbooks, writing our history books that future generations are going to read. In order for those stories to get into those books, historians need access to them. So we're trying to, and a lot of it is oral because a lot of this wasn't written down. So we're having to rely on, stories that people have told, folklore, folk life kind of stuff, which enough of it, then you start getting a better sense of the picture of what we're trying to do. So.
Thank you so much. Well, so we're out of time, but if anyone is interested in learning more, there is information at austinhistorycenter.org. Again, that's austinhistorycenter.org, and it's the Community Archives program that we had just been talking about here at the end. Thanks again so much, Mike, for coming and talking to us.
Thank you, Kanya.
Details about the Austin Public Library radio show are online at library.austintexas.gov/volumes. Thanks for listening to Volumes, the Austin Public Library radio show. Special thanks to our producer, DJ Harris, and to the musicians who composed and performed our original theme song, Andrew Noble on violin, Kirk Duvall on guitar, and Mike Wheat on percussion. And thanks to you, our listeners. Volumes, the Austin Public Library radio show, airs Wednesday afternoons at 2:30 on Co-op 91.7 FM and koop.org. If you catch us mid-show, full episodes and other details can be found at library.austintexas.gov/volumes.